Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Monday, July the 17th, 2023, and today what I'm going to do is what I normally do on a Monday, is look at this book, which is Propaganda by Jacques Ellul, and this is what I call a long form piece. So what that means is some of this is going to be on YouTube, Rumble, and whatever the other one is, Odyssey. All of it will be on my Substack for my paid Substack subscribers. As I said before, eventually when I go away, which I probably will, I'll just release all that to people for free. But for right now, this is the way that some people kindly support my work. But as I say, some of it will be on YouTube, and so that's that bit. Now, this book is relevant because we are living under propaganda. Now, I'm not here to rail against that fact. I prefer to deal with facts as they are, rather than to look at life as I would like it to be. It is what it is. You are ruled. You are viewed by your rulers as the dirty masses. They control your minds. And I don't naturally, essentially have really a problem with any of that. The caste system, despite what they've told you about equality and all the rest of it, exists, and I don't have a problem with that either. So I'm not interested in trying to sort of wake up the masses. The masses have never woken up. Why should they? What I'm really trying to do is to share the ideas of propaganda as set out in Ellul's book with very few people. This is going to be, a small number of people who are able to think and are actually of more value than all the rest put together. And this is just reality. As far as I'm concerned, I could be wrong. I know this is unpopular, but I don't care. So what I'm going to do is read through this. The problem with Ellul is he writes in a rather terse, somewhat dry, somewhat uninteresting style. And, it's worth trying to unpack it for people who can pay attention long enough to listen to the points he's got to make. I do recommend buying this book. I don't have shares in the company. There's no, affiliate link or anything like this. But get a copy of it while you still can. It's called Propaganda, The Formation of Men's Attitudes by Jacques Ellul. And it was written in 1964, 1965. And while you're at it, get a copy of his book, The Technological Society. And if you read those two books slowly and understand them, you'll pretty much be prepared for what you're living through. I don't care about any of this. For me, if you know my broader work, I see life in terms of preparing in this life for eternity. But I'm not a Jehovah's Witness. I'm not going to just sit around wasting my talents. If you want to look at my broader work, then look at the God Protocol, which you can download for free from you get to it from samgerrans.com. You get to everything from there. And I'm not here to sell you books. I don't care if you buy my books or not. You can download everything that I've done. You can get for free, including audios, everything. But if you want to understand how you're being manipulated, if you care, probably you won't, because it's very effective. But if you do, then it's worth reading this book, Propaganda, and internalizing its concepts. Anyway, we'll just jump into it. I'll read about a paragraph or two for YouTube, and then the rest of it, about 2/3, 3/4 of it will be just on Substack. So let's just jump in. This part is starts on page 43, and it's called Timeliness, which is such a clickbaity title. I had to change it to something else. Propaganda and Current Events. That's what he's going to be talking about. So, propaganda, in its explicit form, must relate solely to what is timely. Man can be captured and mobilized only if there is consonance between his own deep social beliefs and those underlying the propaganda directed at him. And he will be aroused and moved to action only if the propaganda pushes him towards a timely action. See what I mean? It's kind of boring, isn't it? But we'll do our best to break it up and sort of dumb it down and serve it up in a more of a meme-friendly manner. Although there is a limit to what you can do. These two elements are not contradictory, but complementary. For the only interesting and enticing news is that which presents a timely, spectacular aspect of society's profound reality. All right, let's just kind of break this down. What's he actually talking about here? What he's actually talking about is that you haven't got the attention span of a goldfish. All right, and what you need is the next new shiny thing. That's how propaganda works, but it's a bit bigger than that. And the next new shiny thing that you are going to be given to want has to relate to a set of myths, a set of things that you already believe, i.e. to the propaganda you've already been indoctrinated in. Now that propaganda, there are two different types of propaganda. There's integral or integrated propaganda, which is what I call ground bait. This is background propaganda. This is what you get through so-called education. It's what you get in things like music, films, stories. It's natural that you should have a worldview, but whereas worldviews used to kind of develop organically, your worldview's been designed for you. And if you want to see the new worldview, just see what your children are being indoctrinated into in Western schools. In fact, any school, but certainly Western schools, they're being trained into sodomy and paedophilia, and to become highly sexualized, completely lost. With any, they're also been indoctrinated into a sort of transhumanist, non-humanist point of view. Anyway, that's all background stuff. You won't notice that. That's the water the goldfish swims in. But then you have what you might consider the food that's being dropped in into the goldfish bowl. And this is agitprop. These are things that you're going to be provoked or stimulated into thinking are really important as you float around in your goldfish bowl. These bits of flotsam and jetsam apparently just drop from like manna from the heavens, and you eat these as you go along. You miss some of them, and they go down to form the sediment at the bottom of the goldfish bowl. That's how it works. So Russia's unprovoked war of aggression, illegal unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, or homophobia, or whatever it is, anti-Semitism, whatever it is, these key terms that you think mean something but actually probably don't. That's what you catch. And these are designed, they're crafted. I know, because I used to work in this area. I know exactly how it works. They're crafted. Just do it. That would be an example of one. It's all marketing. It's a marketing. It's a way of giving you a semblance of knowledge without you don't actually know anything about anything, probably. I think it was William J. Casey, who was the head of the CIA in, I think it was 1981. He said that we will know that our strategy or policy of misinformation, disinformation is complete when everything the American public knows is false. This was 1981, so that's whatever it was, 42, 43 years ago. And when they're talking about the American public, they just mean the public, because for them, the world is America. Almost everything you believe is false. I mean, at least in a short term, that's true. And because, that's despite what they tell you about your opinion being important, which is a very effective policy of flattering people, it's complete lies. Your opinion means nothing. As you will have noticed, if you have a memory, if you still have one, you can notice that the agenda that's been rolled out has got nothing to do with what you think. Did you want the sodomization of your children as a sort of worldview policy? No, of course not. Did you want what's happened to your country if you live in the West over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years? No, you didn't choose that at all. Did you want the tyranny of delusional women able to destroy you and your family at the drop of a hat? My feelings have changed. No, you didn't. You didn't want any of that. Did you have a choice? No, of course not. Did it matter who you voted for? No, of course not. So you're irrelevant, and it's best just to start there. Our opinion doesn't count. My opinion doesn't count. Your opinion doesn't count. Nobody's opinion counts. What matters is what the rulers want. And what propaganda does is keep you on the plantation long enough for them to drive through an agenda. And I'm not complaining about any of this. From my own personal point of view, my big beef with the ruling elite is not that they are the ruling elite. You wouldn't do any better. And in fact, putting you lot in power would be just a lot worse. At least you don't have a background in it. You're not prepared to do it. My problem is that the ruling elite themselves are degenerate, and they've gone off the plantation of what historically they were required to do, which is to, at least to some extent, I mean, obviously they murdered you in large quantities, but then they regard you as the herd, as the stock, is that they've completely reneged on any attachment to noblesse oblige, which is a rather old term and not much used, but this is how things used to be, that the aristocrats had some long-standing commitment to the herd because they would need them in the future, you see. But that's all changed, and the reason why it's changed is because they think that they've got a technical solution to a spiritual problem. That's what they think. They think that they're going to solve the death problem by some sort of technical means. That's what they're really betting on. And they also think they don't need you to dig their ditches for them anymore because they've got machines and all of that now. So they don't need you anymore. So what they're doing is throwing that whole concept of noblesse oblige under the bus. And what they're going to do is get rid of most of you because you're just drain on resources. I know you think that you're important and that your life is meaningful and it really matters where you go on holiday and all that. But to them, you're just basically a statistic that needs to be managed. And they don't need you anymore on their plantation as they see it. And they're right, they don't need you anymore. So what they do is because there are very few of them and a lot of you, and they're more intelligent than you, and they've got more experience than you in any of this, right, is they manage you through these tools, and it's just a tool set. And if it sounds like I'm being blasé and so on, you're going to die anyway. They're going to die too. And, what you do in this life, as it says in Gladiator, echoes in eternity. So make that count, okay? I wouldn't rail too much about the ruling elite, the fact that they own you. They always own you. It doesn't make any difference. But a few people, very few, and that's all I've ever been interested in, are going to understand this and be able to sort of respond to it. You won't be able to wake people up. People don't care. They like being brainwashed. In fact, if you read both technique and and propaganda, you'll see that there's a natural corollary between technique. I'm not going to get into what it is exactly here. It's kind of like technology is a manifestation of it, but it's not the only one. And propaganda is that there's a demand for propaganda. Living under what, let's call it modernity, is so horrible. It's kind of existentially, it's so foreign to what we're naturally born to live in, that you need propaganda. Without it, you'd go nuts. You wouldn't be able to stand it. Anyway, that's the sad fact of it. But anyway, let's just carry on with this. A man will become excited over a new automobile because it is immediate evidence of his deep belief in progress and technology. And you do believe these things. And I'll quickly run over it. I think it's on page 39. I've mentioned this several times, but I'll mention it again. The things that you actually believe, the things you think you believe, and the things you actually believe, there's usually a big difference between these. Most people will never visit what it is they actually believe. But I'll just tell you what they are, and this is really my argument about why I'm in this big brouhaha in certain quarters about the fair world order, Russia and BRICS. I happen to live in Russia, if you've just come across my channel and have a background in Russia and so on. But the idea being that here in Russia we're setting up this fair world order, this multipolar world. It's all going to be so different. As I've said many times, we've had a multipolar world before. It was called the Cold War. And tens, if not hundreds of millions of people were murdered by their own governments under that. So anyway, just drop that. But what I want to say is just to repeat from page 39 that what people actually believe is it doesn't make any difference where you live, unless you live in the Amazon rainforest or somewhere. You all believe exactly the same thing. And those are four things. And this is from page 39. The common presuppositions of bourgeois and proletarian, which is what we all are now. We're actually regressing. It's a regression, debasement of the castes down to the most base and stupid levels. We're not progressing at all. We're going backwards. Basically 4 things. The first is that the man's aim in life is happiness. This is new. This is, if you wonder why people are so solipsistic, selfish, self-absorbed, basically narcissists, because this is a religion. Okay, and it doesn't matter where you live. If you live in London or New York or Moscow, and I've spent a lot of time in certainly London and Moscow, and some time in New York, and out of Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, I've been there too, and it doesn't make any difference. People are essentially the same, not just in terms of their kind of pre-existing characteristics, but in what they want. They're just as selfish and solipsistic everywhere, because that's the world religion. So that's the first one. The second is that man is naturally good, which is a new idea. Our forefathers didn't believe this. Certainly, if you're going to talk about the monotheistic religions, I mean, certainly we can attain righteousness and goodness and so on, but we're not born good. We're not essentially good. But humanism has this as a postulate. Where do you think all of that entitlement ideology comes from? It's the idea that you're good. You just deserve it. Just me, my feelings. There you are. It's a religion. This is what you really believe. I'm not talking about what you claim to believe. This is what you really believe. The next one is that history develops in endless progress. We had the Model T and now we've got a Tesla. You see, progress. Again, if you go back historically, people didn't believe this. For most of human history, men did not believe this. Our forefathers didn't believe this. And in fact, our experience is actually quite schizophrenic when it comes to this. There are very few things that you can buy today that actually will last. The only thing that I've come across recently that is as good, perhaps now, as something my grandmother would have bought, is cast iron frying pans. You still buy them. They'll last a lifetime. Everything else is all disposable. But this is progress, but you don't see it, you forget about it, because the next thing, right? I'm not arguing against this. I'm just explaining to you this is what you actually believe. It doesn't matter what you call yourself, Muslim, Christian, atheist. This is what you actually believe. And the last one is that everything is matter. And this is implicit in the ideas of evolution, of this whole cosmogony where we all are on a spinning ball flying around the sun and all of this stuff. Men didn't believe any of this. All I'm trying to say is this is a new religion, and it is a religion, and you have to believe it if you want to exist within the mainstream, and you probably do believe it, at least subconsciously, and that's the real religion. So, anyway, distracted by a telephone call. Let's just get on with this. Between news that can be utilized by propaganda and fundamental currents of society, the same relationship exists as between waves and the sea. Now, what's he talking about here? What he's talking about, and I know it's kind of dull, or at least it appears to be that way if you read it just sort of superficially, is that propaganda, in order to be effective, and in being effective, it means it can manipulate your mind into going along with whatever the agenda actually is, relates either to what's new, it's called the news, right? News, or to the current, what is current. And historical things can still be current. And I'll just give you some examples. For example, some of the World War II propaganda, which is still current, it's necessary, it's still used now. So although what's happened today, person X did so and so, that's obvious. But let's just take some World War II propaganda, so which is still needed now. So there are 3 points. Number one, actually this wasn't World War II, the first point. It was invented in the 1970s, because I'm old enough to remember this, when the Jewish experience, or claimed experience, of the Second World War was really pumped up, and it was in the early 1970s. It didn't actually happen during the Second World War itself, but the idea is, and people believe this, and if you question it, you're a heretic, is that Jewish suffering is intrinsically more valuable than that of others. And the reason, although you could say, well, this relates to World War II, it's actually necessary now because of other agenda items. A second would be allied countries are more righteous than other countries. And this, of course, was implicit in the Second World War, but it's necessary now because the inheritor of the allies is NATO, although actually if we're going to look at Ukraine, they're fighting on the side of Nazis. But Nazism doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to you. Why would you care about any of that? Anyway, you, as a part of, and we'll get to, a part of propaganda is the ability to forget. Like a goldfish, you just forget. Today's enemy is tomorrow's friend, and you can go backwards and forwards. Just read 1984. And the third one is that democracy or liberal values is an unalloyed good. And what we mean by democracy and progressive liberalism is basically just you and your feelings, because there is no objective definition of any of this. It's just them and us. And these are older myths, but they're still needed now in order to keep you on the plantation of whatever's going on today. And so what my point is that whilst news is needed in terms of distraction value and so on, I'm talking about whoever it is, he said, she said, this happened, outrage, so and so on. The historical stuff is still brought up if it's necessary for what's going on now. You'll notice that every couple of months in Western media there'll be some new thing about the claimed Jewish experience of the Second World War. And you're never allowed to forget that. You will never be allowed to forget that. Children in Western schools will study the diary of Anne Frank, but they won't study their own history. What they're studying is an indoctrination process necessary for the kind of slaves that they're going to be. That's how it works. Okay. To continue, the waves exist only because the underlying mass supports them. Without it, there would be nothing. And this point is it's interesting that it's called current events. The currents are where it's going. The masses, the waves are what you look at, but the current, you don't design the current. Until I mentioned it, you probably never even thought that there are such things as currents. But that's where it's going. And those currents will take your mind where they're supposed to go. And that's just how it works, all right? You'll forget this. When this talk's over, you'll as you're listening to this, you'll think, oh, yeah, that's interesting. I've always thought there was something to that. But once this is over, you can be sure within 5 minutes you'll have forgotten all about this, okay? It's how it works. I'm telling you now, you will have forgotten it, okay? The waves exist only because the underlying mass supports them. Without it, there would be nothing. But man sees only the waves. They are what attracts, entices, fascinates him. Through them he grasps the grandeur and majesty of the sea, though this grandeur exists only in the immense mass of water. Similarly, propaganda can have solid reality and power over man only because of its rapport with fundamental currents, but it has seductive excitement and a capacity to move him only by its ties to the most volatile immediacy. It's kind of dull, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It is. But yeah, as I say, every time I deal with Ilul, he's talking to his peers, he's talking to other intelligent men of letters. For example, it's a bit earlier, I suppose, but people like Huxley. If you listen to Huxley talk, he talks in this very exact way. And when people could talk properly and actually read and write properly, this is who he's talking to. And so when we read it in our debased state, and we are debased, I know we've been told we're progressing, we're not. We're all stupider than we were. Me too. I joke a little bit. I say I'm degrading as well, just a little bit slower than everyone else. It's a race to the bottom, and the one who gets there last wins. That's how it works, see? Anyway, so he's writing in a way, he's writing for people who can read and think, which is a pretty big assumption now, which is why I break it down. Every culture has got some things it believes, and it probably doesn't recognize those things. I'll just give you from my experience of living in different cultures and thinking about things. In England, you kind of believe, or at least when I grew up, it might be different now, but God is basically English, and under an English heaven, breathing English air. I think Rupert Brooke is it. You grow up with this, you feel it, and pretty much everybody else who's not English is, oh, poor you. You believe it. You can't help yourself. I suppose every culture has a bit of this. So there's that. If I take Russian culture, I spent over half of my adult life in this country. Russians have an underlying philosophy, and it's to do with suffering, in my view, at least. That there's a suffering ennobles. There's some inherent advantage to suffering, and that's really the state religion. And it doesn't really matter who suffers. Preferable if you can make someone else suffer. But if there's no one else around, you just suffer yourself a bit. Somehow it's supposed to be in intrinsic good, not learning from suffering. No. Just suffering in and for itself. It's got this high moral payload, and everybody believes it. Another thing that everybody believes here is the idea of doing things together. And you can understand why. It's a big country, and there's lots of space, and Russians like to do things. Мы вместе, мы работаем вместе, коллективно. So everything's doing things together and collectively supposed to be so valuable. When sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I'm not saying these are true. I'm just saying this is what they believe. And they're forever cramming themselves into little tiny spaces, whether it's in the metro or in churches. A Russian church is more like a rugby scrum with candles. So this is kind of how it works. The Jewish mythology is really about everybody hating them. That's the religion, and the kind of the idolatry of the Jewish people is basically that, as far as I can see, is that they themselves are the golden calf. That they worship themselves. That seems to be the religion, and rabbis will tell you this. The proof of the God of the Jews is the existence of the Jewish people, despite the fact everybody's hated them for no reason whatsoever over history. It's whether it's true, it's not true, it doesn't matter. I'm talking about unifying myths, and propaganda, in order to work, has to build upon these things. These are the currents, and if you're going to shift people, if you're going to control a herd, then you have to work with what is. You can't create from new cloth. This is what he's talking about. Okay? Where do we stop? To continue, and the timely event that man considers worth retaining, preserving, and disseminating is always an event related to the expression of the myths and presuppositions of a given time and place. It is dull, isn't it? But he's kind of talking about what I'm talking about, or I'm explaining it at least. All right, to continue. Besides, the public is sensitive only to contemporary events. And this is me now. People, and it sounds as though I'm being terribly disrespectful and so on, but it's true. People have got the attention span of a goldfish, and if they didn't, propaganda wouldn't work. And it's probably good that we do forget. It's a natural thing to forget. In fact, the Arabic term insan, which is we find in the Quran, for example, is based on the same root as to forget. It's human to forget, and if we didn't forget, we wouldn't be able to learn to some extent. So there's a reason why we forget. But I'll just give you some things that seemed very, very important not so long ago, but you've forgotten all about. COVID. You remember how important that was? You remember how life-threatening and real and in your face it was, and all day long? How important is it to you now? No, it's all gone. It's disappeared. Cow flu, 9/11, weapons of mass destruction, if you can still remember that far back with Iraq. None of these things mean anything to you, but they can be brought back. Russia, you remember Russia? Of course, I live in Russia, so I have some sort of interest in what goes on here. Terrible Russians not so long ago, how evil they all were. That's just 30, 35 years ago. Then the good Russians, the new Russians, the Russians under Yeltsin, as the war came down, the Russians who allowed, in fact, invited Western carpetbaggers into the country to destroy everything. And now we're back to the bad, evil Russians. Who knows? I mean, I've lived in this country. You get some pretty bad people. You get some pretty good people. I'd say Russians pretty much the same as everybody else, just as materialistic. They're not holy and spiritual, no matter what some people tell you. They're not particularly evil. They're just the same as everyone. And we've got as much delusion here amongst Russian women, for example, as you have in the West. Pretty much. It's a bit further back down the conveyor belt, but they're certainly all going, rushing in the same direction as everywhere else. So, but that doesn't matter. I think that's one of the reasons why they made travel between the West and Russia so difficult, is to stop you from actually meeting any. But anyway, none of this matters as long as your indoctrination is in place. What is interesting, and I do find this interesting, because of course Russia has propaganda to some extent, certainly does, but they're not here vilifying. I don't see it not vilifying the West. I mean, I was in the park just the other week, and they have actual music and dancing, actual almost like ballroom dancing, and they were playing American music. Can you imagine? I mean, they're cancelling everything to do with Russia, cancelling Tchaikovsky or Shostakovich or whoever it is in the West, Pushkin, Lermontov, although Lermontov was Scottish descent, Tolstoy, everything Russian being cancelled, but not all of their scientific breakthroughs. No, we'll keep all those. What I'm trying to say is, propaganda is eclectic, and it just works on what you kind of already believe. At least you've been prepped for it. And I suppose that's one that I hadn't thought of that, but it's one of the great advantages of having such a distracted population now, with even less attention span than they had before, because they're looking at their phones apparently 150 times a day. 150 times a day is the average. So they can't concentrate for more than 5 minutes. In fact, they don't actually concentrate for 5 minutes, which makes them so much easier to manipulate. And my view, for what it's worth, is that this is all temporary. Once they get you plugged into the matrix in terms of some sort of neural connection, which is where they're going, they won't need any of this stuff anymore. And you're pretty much there anyway, through 5G, telephones, nudges, diet, injections, and laws, that they hardly need, any further control, but they're going to get it anyway. And most people like to think, insofar as they do think, and so far as they think about this subject, that they're going to be standing up and fighting the Antichrist. But it's not true. Actually, it isn't. What they'll be doing is competing for a platinum card, a platinum Satan card, as opposed to a gold one. It'll be a status symbol. They'll be fighting each other to get into the prison. That's how it works. And again, this isn't going to be a popular sell, but I don't care. Anyway, let's just carry on. They alone concern and challenge it. Who are we talking about here? Ah, yes. The public is sensitive only to contemporary events. This new distraction thing that you've been given. Obviously, propaganda can succeed only when man feels challenged. Is challenged in the sense of some sort of difficulty to be overcome. It can have no influence when the individual is stabilized, relaxing in his slippers in the midst of total security. And if you've noticed, that all propaganda really deals with some sort of threat, and we are hardwired both to want to identify a threat, to learn about a threat, and in some ways to overcome that threat. Those are hardwired natural drives. Without them, you wouldn't exist. Neither past events nor great metaphysical problems challenge the average individual, the ordinary man of our times. And we're all ordinary men now. The concept of a great man has been completely elided from the culture. If you look back to the heroes of the Greeks and so on, or the saints of the Christian church, or the great imams of the Islamic tradition, or whatever it is. I suppose what we've got now is rock stars and actors. But if you look at rock stars and actors, they're all essentially plebs. And that's what's their attraction, actually. It's not that they're greater men. That's not what makes them interesting. It's that they're just like you. If you look at them, they're boring, nondescript. And their appeal is that they were taken from the mass, and it could happen to you. This keys into your delusion, solipsism, and unreality and delusion, and that's what it's designed to do. I think the Beatles were the first iteration of that. I mean, Elvis Presley, I suppose you could say it was true of him as well, but because Elvis Presley was so staggeringly beautiful as well, he kind of looked like a bit of a god. Whereas the Beatles, they were English, they all had terrible teeth, and they came from Liverpool. So you couldn't get more proletarian than that, if you know anything about British culture at that time. And that's what made the Beatles really, really attractive. It meant that you, coming from Newcastle or wherever, could also become a god. It's the new democratic god, the new plebeian gods, and that's what's different, you see. But they know what to give you, and it's designed. I think Lennon kind of got a bit wise to some of this toward the end, but anyway, we can see. So, this is me now. None of the current events, current in inverted commas, are important to a man whose wife is dying of breast cancer, for example. Just as no current event of 2 years ago is important to the rest of us, except insofar as its propaganda value impacts current events. Going back to my about the mythology is still extant from the Second World War. They're still current because they affect current events. All kinds of different propaganda that was rolled out in the Second World War is forgotten about because they don't need it anymore. So what I'm trying to say is none of this is really important. If you discovered that you had a life-threatening disease, you wouldn't care about all this other stuff that you think's important. And if you look back to, and a part of it is that we are trained to think that our life is an potentially endless round of shopping and sort of physical or carnal desires and pleasures, and that death, the big problem, the big fly in the ointment, is something that happens. It's some sort of mistake. It's an error. It's page 404. Something went wrong. People who die are almost treated as if they've committed some sort of sin. I mean, they kind of have, given the broader philosophy that people live under, that they labour under, and that people who are old and going to die soon, people don't even talk. They won't even use the word death or dying or he died. They now use they sanitize it, and they don't even use passing away. They use he passed. Like he just sort of overtook in a car or something. He passed. No, he didn't. He died. That's what happened to this person. He died. Good book to read is The Death of Ivan Ilyich. It's a short story by Tolstoy. And in this story, the main character, Ivan Ilyich, he's dying. He's the master of his house. He's married. His entire family ignore it. It basically doesn't fit in with their solipsistic little life. But I think Tolstoy was going through his Christian phase, or just entering into it. This is I imagine after the big two, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. Anyway, there's a character in this book called Gerasim, who is a peasant man who understands that the master's dying, and he just tries to. I think he does things like sort of lifts his leg up, puts them on his shoulder so that to improve his circulation, so that just make him feel better. But he understands. He treats him as a man who's dying. He understands that death is real. So even then, when would that have been? 1860s, 1870s, something like that. Even then, solipsistic, narcissistic people, and that's what Tolstoy was trying to sort of describe. So where were we? Yes, none of this would be important. None. If you discovered you had leukemia, or whatever it was. And none of these current events would be important to you, none of them. And they're not important. Actually, they're not. And yes, that's where I was going with this. Traditional man was aware of death as the obvious outcome of his life. And that's why distraction is so important, because it keeps you from this actual thing that is going to happen to you. You can be certain of it. It doesn't matter what your belief in quote-unquote progress is going to be. How much of a zealot you are, you're going to die. I use the example of old man Rockefeller, David Rockefeller. 6 heart transplants, 6. That man had 6. I'd be quite surprised if the people who provided those hearts didn't actually need them at the time they were removed. But the fact is, he with all of his money couldn't evade death. Traditional man understood this. Traditionally, children were born in the house. The grandmother would die in the house, in one house. You had a sense of your connectedness to birth and death. I met a man once. He was a builder. I liked him a lot. He still lives, as far as I know, in the mountains of North Wales. Built his own house, lives there with his wife. And I spent New Year's with him and his wife, with some friends of mine at that time. Anyway, he told me a story. He said when his mother died, he laid her out. Now, laying out means what you do is you undress and prepare the body for death, for burial. That's what laying out means. He didn't hand this task over to somebody else. He didn't use the word pass. He used the word died. His connection with death was real. In the Russian Orthodox tradition, I believe it's the same in the Catholic tradition as well, you would kiss an open casket. Burial of somebody who's dead is that you kiss the forehead of the deceased. It's not just a mark of respect, but it's a way of, the lips are the most sensitive part of the body. You're kissing the person who had been warm and alive when you kissed them last, or knew them last. And when you kiss the skin of a deceased person, of a dead person, it brings that reality home to you. I once had to, I didn't have to, but I did accompany a close friend of mine whose mother was dying in a Russian hospital. And she happened to die when I was there. And the way it works in a Russian hospital is you're supposed to be present. A family member is supposed to be present when they lay out the body. So they can't be accused of theft. That's what it's for. And he couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. It was too much for him. So I said, "You go and wait downstairs. I'll go." So I was there and assisted in moving the body from the bed to the gurney and all the rest of it. So if you see death, and see that you see it up close and personal, it changes all the rest of this stuff, all of this modern stuff, all of these current events. The only really big current event that's really current and is going to stay current is the fact that you're going to die and what happens thereafter. That's the way I would see it, at least. But all of this is about distracting you from all of that. Anyway, let's carry on. To continue. Neither past events nor great metaphysical problems challenge the average individual, the ordinary man of our times. And as I say, men are becoming more and more ordinary. If you just look at music, when we have to go back as far as, say, the great composers, we don't have any great composers now. There are no great composers. Music is all proletarian. Now, there's always been a certain amount of proletarian music, and that's fine. But that's all we have now. There is nowhere to grow to. There's only plebeian stuff. He is not sensitive to what is tragic in life. He is not anguished by a question that God might put to him. He does not feel challenged except by current events, political or economic. Okay, it's a way of keeping you distracted from the actual things that are going to matter to you ultimately. Therefore, propaganda must start with current events. It would not reach anybody if it tried to base itself on historical facts. And that's for sure. And as I've said, bringing in some of sort of the this propaganda from the Second World War and later propaganda built upon ideas around the Second World War is that it has a very long half-life. And the reason why it survives is because it's necessary for current policy implementations of the elites. Just on a thought before I close this part for the YouTube part of this presentation, what you notice, obviously my original and major presentation has been to do with the Quran and comparing it with the traditionalists, sort of what I call brand Islam presentation, and actually looking at the subject, what it talks about itself, as opposed to this propaganda version. Is when you do read the Quran without all of the religion, then what you see is that it appeals always to the past, to big events of the past, the actual news, the things which happened to Noah, to the people of Thamud, to the people of Ad, to the people of Lot, etc. And it places all of those events within the larger context of the Day of Judgment, eternity, and so on. What I would call the satanic system does is it wants to distract you from all of that and get you involved in all of the insipid details. Anyway, if you want more on that, you can download all of my work for free. If you go to samgerrans.com, look at books, it'll take you to the links. It's PDF. It's not a demo version. It's not like I'm not trying to trick you into buying something. I don't care if you buy it or not. You can print it off in your own printer if you wish to at home for your own personal reading. You can buy a hard copy if you want. It's up to you, but you don't have to. There's also audio, where that, in fact, 2 of my books I read onto audio. You can download all of that for free if you want. Those things will help you to think a bit broader than, Russia's illegal unprovoked war of aggression, or COVID, or cow flu, or 9/11, or whatever nonsense it is, homophobia, whatever nonsense it is that they've, or maybe not nonsense, but things they've got you thinking about. Just think in terms of how important all of that would be if you discovered that somebody you love or yourself, for example, had some life-threatening disease. And actually, you do have a life-threatening disease. It's called life. It's going to end at some point. You might as well kind of work within that context. And in fact, what's interesting is that if you start from that and work inwards, you'll actually be better equipped to deal with these lesser questions. Anyway, I'll wrap that up there. Details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel, support my work, and download my books free are in the description. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.